Imagine this. You're a Soviet tank commander in the summer of 1943, and you've just stumbled upon the enemy's most advanced killing machine, sitting silent in a field of scorched wheat. Your heart pounds. Is it a trap? Your crew approaches cautiously, weapons raised. The hatch is open. Inside you find something that will haunt you forever. Not bodies, not weapons, but the realization of why so many of your brothers never made it home. Before we dive into this incredible true story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and whether you knew the hidden truth about the Eastern Front's most brutal tank battles. The Battle of Kursk wasn't just another clash of armies. It was the largest tank battle in human history, an apocalyptic collision of steel and fire that would determine the fate of nations. Over 6,000 tanks and assault guns faced each other across the Russian steppe. And beneath the thunder and smoke lay a terrible secret that Soviet command desperately tried to hide from their own men. The T-34, celebrated in propaganda as the greatest tank ever built, was being slaughtered at ratios that defied belief. For every German Panther destroyed, 4, 5, sometimes 6 T-34s burned. The official Soviet doctrine called it mass assault tactics. The tankers who survived had another name for it: the meat grinder. And at the center of this industrial-scale horror was a machine so advanced, so brilliantly engineered, that capturing one intact would become the Soviet Union's most urgent military priority. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Shomin had commanded his T-34 through 18 months of hell. He'd fought at Stalingrad, survived the winter counteroffensive, and watched friends die in metal coffins that brewed up like matches when German shells found their mark. He was 24 years old and felt 50. His crew, driver Alexei Petrov, gunner Yuri Volkov, loader Ivan Sokolov, and radio operator Mikhail Orlov, had somehow stayed alive through battles that consumed entire tank brigades in hours. They trusted each other with that unspoken bond that only forms when you've shared a steel box while the world explodes around you. On July 17, 1943, during a probing mission near the village of Prokhorovka, they encountered something that would shatter everything they thought they understood about their war. The Panther sat motionless in a ravine, partially concealed by shattered trees. Its long 75mm gun pointed at nothing, and there were no signs of crew activity. Shomin's first instinct was ambush. The Germans were masters of deception, but his fuel was low, ammunition nearly exhausted, and orders were explicit. Any intact German equipment was to be secured at all costs. He radioed his position, and for 30 agonizing minutes, they watched the Panther through their crude periscopes, waiting for movement, for the flash that would mean death. Nothing. The silence was more terrifying than combat. Finally, Shomin made the decision that would change his life. They would investigate on foot. As they approached, the scale of the machine became overwhelming. The T-34 was considered a medium tank, but beside the Panther, it looked like a child's toy. The armor was sloped at angles that seemed impossible, each plate overlapping in a geometry designed by minds that understood physics as warfare. The tracks were wider, the suspension more complex, and that gun, that horrifyingly long gun, spoke of killing power. That could reach across distances where Soviet tankers couldn't even see their targets. Petrov, the driver, whispered what they were all thinking. How are we supposed to fight this? No one answered. Because they all knew. You weren't supposed to fight it alone. You were supposed to die in waves until the odds finally, mercifully, turned in your favor. Inside the Panther, the revelation was even more devastating. While Soviet tankers operated in cramped darkness, squinting through primitive vision blocks, the German crew had worked in what felt like a laboratory. The commander's cupola offered 7 periscopes with crystal-clear optics, providing a panoramic view that made the T-34's visibility seem like peering through a keyhole. The gunner's position featured a stereoscopic rangefinder, technology that allowed precise distance calculation, while Soviet gunners relied on estimation and prayer. The shells were stored in protected bins with blowout panels, while T-34 ammunition sat exposed throughout the fighting compartment, ready to cook off and incinerate the crew if penetrated. Every system spoke of a philosophy fundamentally different from Soviet design. German engineers built for crew survival and combat effectiveness. Soviet engineers built for production speed and numerical superiority. Volkov the gunner sat in the Panther's gunner seat and suddenly understood why his skills, honed through countless battles, meant so little. "The gun stabilization," he said, his voice hollow. "It's vertical. They can fire accurately while moving. We have to stop, aim, hope." He looked at Shomin with eyes that had seen too much. "We're not fighting tankers, Comrade Lieutenant. We're fighting machines that make our training irrelevant." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. Each man was calculating how many friends had died not from lack of courage or skill, but because they'd been sent to fight with inferior tools. The propaganda. Posters back home showed heroic T-34s crushing fascist armor. The reality was waves of Soviet tanks charging German positions, the first 3 or 4 dying to establish range and position before the 5th or 6th might get close enough for their guns to penetrate. But the most disturbing discovery waited in the Panther's technical documentation, miraculously intact in a sealed compartment. The Germans had designed this tank knowing exactly what it would face. Intelligence reports, performance, specifications of the T-34, vulnerability assessments. It was all there. The Panther wasn't just engineered to be superior, it was engineered specifically to kill Soviet tanks with industrial efficiency. The armor thickness and angles were calculated to deflect 76mm shells at all but point-blank range. The gun could penetrate T-34 armor from 2 kilometers away. The optics gave German crews first-sight advantage in nearly every engagement. And the production costs, while higher than the T-34, were justified by kill ratios that bordered on the obscene. One line in a captured manual haunted showmen. Expect multiple enemy vehicles per engagement. Prioritize furthest target first to maximize panic and confusion in attack wave. The implications exploded through Soviet high command like a different kind of bomb. When Shomin's captured Panther reached the research facilities at Kubinka tank proving ground, teams of engineers and military officials descended on it with desperate intensity. Colonel Engineer Mikhail Kotin, one of the Soviet Union's leading tank designers, spent 3 days examining every aspect of the vehicle. What he found challenged the fundamental assumptions of Soviet armored warfare. The T-34 had been designed under 2 primary constraints: simplicity for mass production and low manufacturing cost to enable numerical superiority. These weren't flaws, they were deliberate choices based on Soviet industrial capacity and military doctrine. But facing the Panther? Those choices suddenly looked like fatal compromises. The test firings were brutal. Soviet crews took turns firing captured German weapons at T-34s, and the results were nightmarish. From 1,500 meters, the Panther's 75mm gun penetrated the T-34's frontal armor with contemptuous ease. The Soviet 76-meter gun, in return, could only reliably penetrate the Panther's side armor at under 500 meters, and even then only with specific angles and ammunition types. One test officer, observing the demonstration, made an unauthorized comment that nearly cost him his commission. "We've been feeding our boys into a slaughterhouse and calling it tactics." The political officer accompanying the tests filed a report. But the technical findings were impossible to ignore. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the wreckage of hundreds of T-34s across the Kursk battlefield. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Among the engineering team analyzing the Panther was a quiet man named Alexander Morozov. He wasn't a high-ranking official or a celebrated designer. He was an assistant engineer, mid-30s, with a limp from childhood polio that had kept him from frontline service. While senior engineers marveled at German technology and argued about copying specific systems, Morozov studied the Panther with different eyes. He'd spent years before the war studying metallurgy and armor physics in obscurity, publishing papers that few read and fewer understood. His ideas about tank design had been dismissed as impractical, over-engineered, too complex for Soviet industrial reality. But now, looking at the Panther, he saw not just a superior enemy weapon, but a puzzle with a solution. The senior engineers wanted to copy the Panther's features: thicker armor, better optics, longer guns. Morozov argued for something more radical, understanding the principles behind the design and applying them within Soviet constraints. "We cannot build Panthers," he told a skeptical review board. "Our factories aren't tooled for it, our supply chains can't support it, and copying always leaves you one generation behind. But we can build something that addresses the same problems with our strengths instead of imitating their strengths." The room erupted in argument. Copying German technology was safe, proven. Morozov's approach was theoretical, risky, and championed by a man most in the room had never heard of. Colonel Kotin, however, saw something in the younger engineer's eyes. Not arrogance, but the quiet certainty of someone who'd been preparing for this moment his entire career. What followed was one of the most compressed and intense engineering programs in military history. Morozov was given a small team and 3 months to prove his concept. A tank that could match the Panther's effectiveness without replicating its design. He worked 20-hour days, sleeping in the workshop, eating at his drafting table. His approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of thicker armor everywhere, concentrated at critical angles. Instead of copying German optics, improve crew training and positioning to minimize the advantage. Instead of matching the Panther's gun millimeter for millimeter, develop ammunition that maximized penetration from a caliber Soviet industry could actually produce in quantity. And most radically, accept that individual tank superiority wasn't achievable, but designed for coordinated pack tactics. That turned the Soviet numerical advantage into a genuine strategic asset instead of just feeding more casualties into battle. The prototype that emerged was designated Object 136. It looked nothing like the Panther, yet it addressed every vulnerability the captured tank had exposed. The armor was sloped even more radically than the T-34s, and while thinner in absolute terms than the Panthers, the angles made it nearly equivalent in protection. The gun was an 85 mm, not as powerful as the Panther's 75 mm in raw terms, but firing improved ammunition that could penetrate German armor at reasonable combat distances. The crew layout was redesigned for faster target acquisition and engagement, and the entire vehicle was engineered to be produced in existing Soviet factories with minimal retooling. Morozov had done the impossible. Created a response to German technical superiority that acknowledged Soviet industrial reality. But here's where our story's antagonists truly emerge, and they weren't German. General Anatoly Kravchenko, head of the main Auto-Armored Directorate, was a tank commander of the old school, a veteran of the Civil War who'd risen through ranks by following doctrine and pleasing superiors. To him, Morozov's design represented dangerous independent thinking and the implicit criticism of existing Soviet designs, including those Kravchenko had approved. When Object 136 came up for official review, Kravchenko arrived with a team of allies determined to bury the project. "We don't need experimental fantasies," he announced to the review committee. "We need more T-34s. Production, production, production. That's how we beat the Germans. We drown them in steel." His voice carried the weight of authority and 2 decades of military service. Morozov, the assistant engineer with the limp, looked like a child playing at war beside him. The confrontation in that review chamber became legendary among Soviet tank designers. Kravchenko systematically attacked every aspect of Morozov's design. Too complex, too expensive, unproven. "You're asking us to retool factories in the middle of a war based on the theories of someone who's never commanded a tank in battle," Kravchenko declared, his voice dripping with contempt. "Meanwhile, men are dying because we don't have enough tanks, and you want to slow production for this experiment?" The committee nodded. The logic was compelling. Colonel Kotin attempted to defend the design, but even he seemed to waver under Kravchenko's assault. The general's final argument was devastating in its simplicity. The T-34 won at Moscow. It won at Stalingrad. It's winning at Kursk. Why do we need anything else? Morozov listened to it all in silence. His face showed nothing. No anger, no frustration, just that same quiet certainty. When Kravchenko finally finished and the committee prepared to vote, Morozov asked for permission to speak. The chairman, clearly ready to end the meeting, reluctantly agreed. What happened next would be retold in engineering schools for generations. Morozov didn't defend his design. He didn't argue with Kravchenko's logic. Instead, he asked a simple question. "General Kravchenko, how many tanks were in your command at the beginning of the Kursk offensive?" Kravchenko, puzzled but confident, answered, 248 T-34s. The pride of the Soviet Union. The room waited. Morozov's next question was delivered in that same quiet tone. "And how many returned?" The silence was deafening. Kravchenko's face darkened. "Casualties are part of war. We achieved our objectives." Morozov nodded slowly. 81 tanks returned, General. I checked the records. That's a 67% loss rate in 2 weeks of fighting. At Prokhorovka specifically, where Lieutenant Shomin captured the Panther we're discussing, your brigade lost 42 tanks in 4 hours. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. The T-34 is winning, General, but it's winning by trading 3, 4, 5 of our crews for every German tank destroyed, and we're running out of trained tankers faster than we're running out of tanks. The tension in the room was palpable. Morozov had done something unthinkable. He'd challenged a general with facts, not opinions. But Morozov wasn't finished. He walked to the captured Panther, sitting in the corner of the test facility like a monument to enemy ingenuity. This machine was designed by engineers who knew they'd be outnumbered. Every aspect of it is built to maximize the effectiveness of a single crew against multiple opponents. The Germans understand something we've refused to admit. Industrial capacity alone doesn't win wars. Efficiency does. He turned back to face Kravchenko directly, and for the first time his voice carried an edge. "You want more T-34s, General? We're producing them at remarkable rates. But we're also producing orphans and widows at remarkable rates because we're sending good men to fight with adequate tools against excellent tools. That's not tactics. That's not strategy. That's just waste. The room erupted. Some committee members defended Kravchenko. Others seemed shaken by Morozov's words. But the general himself was beyond anger. He was experiencing something far worse. Public doubt. A mid-level engineer had just called him out for wasteful tactics in front of the Soviet Union's military-industrial leadership. Kravchenko stood, his face red, jabbing his finger at Morozov. How dare you question Soviet military doctrine? You, who've never faced enemy fire, who've never commanded men in battle. You think reading reports makes you qualified to judge decisions made in the heat of combat? His voice was shaking now, not with anger but with something deeper. The terrible suspicion that this limping engineer might be right. Morozov didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I question doctrine when the evidence demands it, General. And I've read every after-action report. From Kursk. I've read accounts from survivors describing how they watched the first wave die to spot enemy positions, the second wave die to suppress them, and the third wave die before finally getting close enough to fight. I've read letters from commanders begging for better equipment, better training, better tactics, anything to reduce the casualties. Those reports, General, came from your command. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that room knew someone who'd died in a T-34. The statistics weren't abstract. They were brothers, sons, husbands, friends. But then something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Shomin, who'd been present as the tanker who captured the Panther, stepped forward without permission. A frontline officer interrupting a high-level review was breach of protocol bordering on career suicide. But Shomin's voice was steady. Comrade General, Engineer Morozov speaks truth. We don't question your courage or your service, but in my tank we've developed a saying. First in wave dies for Stalin, second for the motherland, third for his crew, fourth gets lucky. We joke because the alternative is madness. When I sat in that Panther, I understood why we have to attack in waves. It's not tactics, it's mathematics. We need numerical advantage because we're fighting superior machines. If Engineer Morozov has designed something that changes that mathematics, shouldn't we at least test it? The intervention was brilliant because it came from someone Kravchenko couldn't dismiss, a decorated combat officer with the frontline credibility Morozov lacked. Other voices joined in. Test officers described the firing trials. Engineers detailed the production feasibility studies. Slowly, reluctantly, the tide turned. But Kravchenko wasn't ready to surrender. He played his final card. Even if this design has merit, we don't have time for it. The Germans are planning their next offensive. We need tanks now, not experimental projects that might work. It was a powerful argument, rooted in the desperate urgency of 1943. The Soviet Union was winning, but barely, and the cost was astronomical. Could they risk innovation when immediate production seemed safer? Morozov's response revealed the depth of his preparation. We don't have to choose, General. My design uses 78% common components with the T-34. Factories can retool sections of their production lines without stopping T-34 production. We can build 50 Object 136 prototypes within existing capacity while maintaining current production rates. If the design fails combat trials, we've lost minimal production. If it succeeds, we have a path forward that saves Soviet lives and maintains our numerical advantage. He had answers for every objection, every concern. This wasn't theoretical. He'd worked out the logistics, the supply chains, the training programs. It was clear this man had been preparing for this moment not for months, but for years. Colonel Kotin, who'd been watching the exchange carefully, finally spoke with the authority of his position. General Kravchenko, your concerns are noted and respected, but I'm authorizing limited production for combat trials. 50 vehicles, as Engineer Morozov suggests. We'll assign them to Lieutenant Shomin's brigade since he has experience with both platforms. 6 months of combat data, then we reconvene. It was a compromise, but it was also a victory for Morozov's approach. Kravchenko knew he'd lost this round, but his expression promised this wasn't over. As the meeting adjourned, he approached Morozov with barely contained hostility. You'd better be right, engineer. Because if those tanks fail, if Soviet soldiers die because of your theories, I will personally ensure you face consequences. Morozov met his eyes without flinching. If my design fails, General, I'll accept whatever consequences come. But if it succeeds, will you accept that courage and production capacity aren't enough? That we owe our soldiers more than patriotic slogans and numerical superiority? It was a direct challenge, and everyone within earshot heard it. Kravchenko had no response. He turned and left, leaving behind a room full of people wondering if they'd just witnessed the beginning of a revolution in Soviet military thinking, or the career suicide of an idealistic engineer. The months that followed were torture for everyone involved. Object 136, eventually designated T-34-85, went into limited production and combat trials in early 1944. Shomin's brigade received the first batch, and the initial reports were mixed. The new tanks were more capable than standard T-34s, but crews needed time to adapt to different handling characteristics and combat procedures. Early engagements showed promise but also teething problems. Mechanical issues that hadn't appeared in testing. Tactical doctrine that needed refinement. Kravchenko used every negative report to argue for cancellation. See? He told anyone. Who'd listen? Experimental nonsense while proven designs wait for resources. But something else was happening on the front lines. Crews who survived engagements in the new tanks reported something unprecedented. They could fight Panthers and Tigers at ranges where they'd previously been helpless. Loss rates in equipped units dropped dramatically. Tank versus tank kills ratios improved from the horrific 4.1 or 5.1 against German armor to near parity. It wasn't perfect, the German tanks were still excellent machines. But for the first time, Soviet tankers felt they were fighting with comparable tools instead of acceptable casualties. The testimonials from crews were overwhelming. One commander wrote, "For the first time since Kursk, I send my men into battle believing they'll come back. That's worth every ruble spent." By summer 1944, the data was undeniable. Brigades equipped with T-34-85s suffered 30 to 40% lower casualties while achieving similar or better tactical objectives compared to standard T-34 units. The tank had proven itself in the ultimate laboratory, combat. The expanded review committee in August 1944 was a very different affair from the previous year's confrontation. Production numbers, combat reports, crew testimonials, everything supported Morozov's design. Even Kravchenko couldn't argue with mathematics when it came in the form of living soldiers instead of smoking wrecks. The recommendation for full production conversion was unanimous, but then came the moment that transformed this story from a mere technical dispute into something profound. As the committee prepared to adjourn with their decision, Morozov asked for one final statement. He approached General Kravchenko, and what he said shocked everyone present. "General, I owe you an apology." Kravchenko looked at him with suspicion, wondering if this was sarcasm. But Morozov's face was serious. "I accused you of waste and questioned your tactics publicly. That was wrong. Not because my facts were incorrect, but because I didn't acknowledge the impossible situation you faced. You commanded men with the tools available, under doctrine you didn't create, in conditions no one should have to endure. The casualties weren't your failure. They were the system's failure. And that includes me. I spent years developing theories while men like you made impossible decisions with inadequate resources. If I'd worked faster, been more persuasive earlier, perhaps some of those too. 148 tankers would still be alive." The room was stunned. This wasn't political theater. It was genuine remorse. Morozov continued, "You questioned whether I could understand battlefield decisions without combat experience. You were right to question that. But Lieutenant Shomin helped me understand something crucial. Everyone in this war is fighting with incomplete information and inadequate resources. You needed better tools. I needed better understanding of frontline reality. We were both right, and we were both wrong to see each other as obstacles instead of different perspectives on the same problem." He extended his hand to Kravchenko. "We should have been working together from the beginning. What happened next was unexpected." Kravchenko, the old warrior who'd built a career on following doctrine and defending Soviet methods, stood silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide. I sent boys to die in machines I knew were inferior. Every commander knows when he's asking too much of his men. We tell ourselves it's necessary, that the cause justifies the cost. But late at night, you wonder if you could have done something different, questioned something sooner." He looked at Morozov, and the hostility was gone, replaced by something raw and human. "You were right to question me, engineer. I was fighting the wrong battle, defending my decisions instead of finding better ones. You're the one who should accept an apology." He took Morozov's hand, and the handshake lasted longer than protocol required. Two men, from completely different worlds, acknowledging that the real enemy had never been each other. Around them, the committee witnessed something rare in Stalin's Soviet Union. Powerful men admitting fault, showing vulnerability, finding common cause beyond ego and politics. Colonel Kotin, observing this, smiled slightly and said what everyone was thinking. Gentlemen, this is what winning looks like. Not just better tanks, but better thinking. The Germans believe their engineering superiority makes them invincible. We're proving that adaptability and willingness to acknowledge mistakes are more powerful than rigid perfection. The full-scale production order went through within weeks. The T-34-85 became the standard Soviet medium tank for the remainder of the war and for decades afterward. It fought from the gates of Berlin to the Korean peninsula, proof that Morozov's approach, understanding principles rather than copying solutions, was correct. But more importantly, the process of its creation changed how Soviet military design worked. Engineers were increasingly consulted early in the process. Frontline feedback loops were formalized. The assumption that more was always better than better began to break down. None of this happened quickly or completely. This was still the Soviet system after all. But the seeds were planted. Lieutenant Shomin and his crew survived the war. They fought in their T-34-85 all the way to Berlin, and while they lost friends and endured horrors, their survival rate was dramatically better than the early days of Kursk. Shomin later became an instructor, teaching new generations of tankers not just how to operate machines, but how to think about combat as a problem-solving exercise rather than just following doctrine. He kept a small piece of the captured Panther, a section of the commander's periscope, as a reminder of what curiosity and willingness to learn from enemies could achieve. General Kravchenko's story is more complex and, in its way, more moving. After the war, he quietly advocated for treating enemy technical intelligence with more respect and less ideological suspicion. He never became a reformer in the dramatic sense, but within his sphere of influence, he made space for questioners like Morozov. In his memoirs, written late in life but never published during the Soviet era, he wrote, "I lost more men to my own pride than I ever did to German guns. The hardest lesson of the war wasn't how to fight the enemy. It was how to listen to people smarter than myself and admit when I was wrong." Coming from a man of his generation and position, such words represented a personal revolution as significant as any technical innovation. And Morozov? He became one of the Soviet Union's leading tank designers, eventually heading the team that created the T-54 and its successors. But those who worked with him reported that he never forgot the lessons of that confrontation with Kravchenko. He actively sought out criticism, created channels for frontline feedback, and built a design philosophy around acknowledging that engineers don't have all the answers. He died in 1979, having shaped the fundamental approach to Soviet armored warfare for a generation. At his funeral, a now elderly showman placed that piece of Panther periscope on the casket, telling mourners, "He taught us that captured wisdom is more valuable than captured equipment." The story of the captured Panther and what it revealed extends far beyond tank design or even military history. It's a story about the dangers of institutional arrogance, the courage required to admit systemic failures, and the transformative power of approaching adversaries, whether foreign enemies or internal critics, as sources of learning rather than threats to defend against. The Soviet Union in 1943 was winning a war against an enemy that had humiliated them in 1941, and the natural human tendency was to declare that their methods were vindicated. Mass production, numerical superiority, willingness to accept casualties for victory. These were working. To question them seemed like questioning the sacrifices of millions. But Morozov, the quiet engineer with the limp, understood something profound. Winning ugly is still ugly. The fact that Soviet tactics were eventually succeeding didn't make them optimal. And every tanker who died because of inferior equipment or doctrine represented not just a casualty of war, but a failure of the system to do everything possible for its soldiers. His willingness to challenge a general, to risk his career for principles he believed in, came from a deep moral conviction that lives had value beyond strategic calculations. And remarkably, amazingly, in a system not known for tolerating dissent, he found enough people who agreed to change how the Soviet Union fought its war. Kravchenko's transformation is equally important because it represents the harder journey, the one where someone in power has to surrender the ego that often comes with authority. It's easy to celebrate the rebel, the outsider who speaks truth to power. It's harder to appreciate the power figure who actually listens, who allows their certainty to be questioned, who values being right over being in charge. Kravchenko could have destroyed Morozov's career with a few words in the right ears. Instead, he allowed himself to be persuaded by evidence and eventually became an ally in reform. That kind of transformation, especially for someone who'd built an identity around strength and decisiveness, requires a different kind of courage. The captured Panther sits today in the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, one of the most significant artifacts of the Eastern Front. Visitors marvel at its engineering, its intimidating size, its historical significance. But the real story isn't visible in the metal, it's in what that machine taught the people who studied it. Not just technical lessons about armor angles and gun calibers, but deeper truths about humility, adaptation, and the constant need to question our assumptions, especially when they seem to be working. The Panther was designed to kill Soviet tanks efficiently, and it succeeded terribly well. But in doing so, it forced the Soviet Union to confront uncomfortable truths and ultimately emerge with better answers. If you've made it this far in this story, I want you to think about where in your life you might be attacking in waves, using brute force or sheer persistence to overcome problems that might have more elegant solutions if you were willing to learn from adversaries or admit current approaches aren't optimal. The engineers who examined that Panther could have simply declared, "We need to build our own Panthers." The generals could have insisted, "Our tactics are fine, we just need more tanks." Both responses would have been easier than the painful work of acknowledging weaknesses and fundamentally rethinking their approach. But easy answers rarely solve hard problems. Hit that like button if this story made you think differently about how we learn from adversaries. Drop a comment sharing a time when admitting you were wrong led to a better outcome than defending your position would have. And subscribe because we've got more stories that reveal the hidden turning points where history balanced on someone's willingness to question the obvious. Share this with someone who needs to hear that courage isn't just about charging forward. Sometimes it's about stopping to ask if you're charging in the right direction. The Eastern Front was won not by the side with the best initial equipment or tactics, but by the side that learned faster and adapted more willingly. That's a lesson that extends far beyond warfare, into every aspect of how we approach problems, competition, and growth. Remember, the Germans built Panthers to kill T-34s. But the Soviets built something more powerful. They built a system that could learn from Panthers and create answers the Germans never anticipated. Technical superiority can win battles. The willingness to acknowledge weakness and transform based on hard truths wins wars. And in your own life, in your own challenges, that difference might be everything.